August 14, 1944, 9 p.m. In the opulent headquarters of Army Group G near Toulouse, Colonel General Johannes Blaskowitz was staring at a map of southern France. The room was tense. For weeks, German intelligence had known the Allies were planning something in the Mediterranean. They had seen the reconnaissance flights. They had tracked the naval buildup in Corsica and North Africa. Blaskowitz was a seasoned commander, a man who had led the invasion of Poland. He knew how to fight armies. He knew how to position Panzer divisions to repel beach landings. But that night the threat wasn't coming from the sea. It was coming from the wires. Throughout the evening, reports had been trickling in from local garrisons, railway stations, and police outposts across the entire southern region. But they weren't combat reports. They were silence. A station master in the Rhone Valley would pick up the phone to report a strange noise, and the line would be dead. A patrol would radio in from a bridge checkpoint, and mid-sentence, the transmission would cut to static. It wasn't a localized outage. It was a spreading darkness. Blaskowitz turned to his signals officer. "Get me the 19th Army headquarters in Avignon," he ordered. The officer tried. He dialed. He patched through switchboards. Nothing. "Try the 11th Panzer Division," Blaskowitz barked. Again, nothing. The officer looked up, his face pale in the dim light. "Sir, the primary trunk lines are cut. The backups are not responding. We have lost contact with the coast." In that moment, Blaskowitz realized the nightmare scenario was unfolding. He wasn't just facing an invasion fleet that was steaming toward the Riviera. He was standing on ground that was turning into quicksand. The French resistance, the terrorists, his SS counterparts had dismissed as ragtag bandits, had just executed the most synchronized act of sabotage in military history. They hadn't just blown up a bridge or two. They had effectively reached into the nervous system of the German military machine and severed the spinal cord. Before we go into next, I want to ask you to subscribe right now and become a member of this channel. Do it so you never miss moments like this, moments where we tell the truth in a calm, clear way. If thousands of you are watching, I hope all 1,000 of you join us, because this community is growing, and your presence truly matters here. So, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Blaskowitz looked at his map again. The markers for his divisions were still there, but in reality, he was blind. He had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tanks, and artillery pieces. But without communication, they were just isolated islands in a hostile sea. And he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that when the sun rose, the Allies wouldn't just be landing on the beaches. They would be walking into a country where the German army had already been deafened and gagged. To understand the panic in that headquarters, you have to understand the German mindset in August 1944. All eyes were on Normandy in the north. The Allies had landed there in June, and the Battle of France was raging. The German High Command, the OKW, had stripped the southern defenses to feed the meat grinder in the north. They had taken the best divisions, the best equipment, and the best commanders, and sent them to fight Eisenhower and Montgomery. What remained in the south was a mix of second-rate infantry battalions, wounded veterans, and foreign conscripts from Eastern Europe who had no desire to die for Hitler. But they still had a formidable defensive advantage: the terrain. The Rhone Valley is a narrow corridor flanked by mountains. It is the only real highway from the Mediterranean to the heart of Europe. If you control the bridges and the tunnels, you can hold off an army 10 times your size. The Germans relied entirely on this infrastructure. They had a sophisticated network of telephone lines, teleprinters, and rail schedules that allowed them to shuttle their limited reserves to wherever the threat appeared. They believed that if the Allies landed, they would have days to react. They would see the ships, telephone the tank divisions, load them onto trains, and smash the beachhead. It was a strategy based on speed and coordination. But this strategy had a fatal flaw. It assumed the land they were standing on was passive. It assumed the French people were beaten. The Gestapo reports from the summer of 1944 tell a different story, one that the military commanders chose to ignore. The reports spoke of a cancer growing in the countryside. They noted that the Maquis, the rural resistance fighters, were no longer hiding in the woods. They were controlling entire villages. When a German officer drove from one town to another, he wasn't just driving through France, he was driving through enemy territory. But the arrogance of the Nazi command blinded them. They called the resistance terrorists. They viewed them as a police problem, not a military one. They thought a few executions and reprisals would keep the population in line. They didn't understand that they weren't dealing with criminals. They were dealing with a shadow army that was waiting for a single signal to turn the entire country into a weapon. And on the night of August 14th, that signal came. This signal didn't come from a general, it came from a radio broadcast that sounded like nonsense. On the evening of August 14th, families all over southern France huddled around forbidden radio sets, listening to the BBC French service. Through the crackle of jamming signals, a voice read out a series of bizarre phrases. The chief is starving. Nancy has a stiff neck. The hunter is hungry. To a German listening in, it sounded like gibberish. To the resistance, it was the go code. The chief is starving meant general uprising. It meant the time for hiding was over. It meant every plan, every stash of dynamite, every stolen machine gun was to be used now, night. The scale of what happened next is difficult to comprehend. We often think of the resistance as guys in berets blowing up a single train track. This was different. This was industrial-scale sabotage. In the department of Var, near the landing beaches, resistance units didn't just cut a wire. They physically removed miles of copper cabling and buried it or threw it in rivers so it couldn't be repaired. In the Alps, they blew up key viaducts, trapping German trains in valleys where they became sitting ducks. They seized local telephone exchanges, not to destroy them, but to listen. Suddenly, the resistance knew more about German movements than the Germans did. A German commander would order a company to move to a new position, and the resistance would know the order before the company commander did. They would mine the road, ambush the trucks, and vanish. One specific example from that night haunts the German records. A frantic report from a garrison commander near Toulon stated, "We are not fighting an enemy unit. The trees are shooting at us. The road signs have been changed. The bridges are gone. We are paralyzed." The commander requested reinforcements. The reply from headquarters never came because the resistance had already cut the line. The Germans had built a fortress, but the resistance had locked the doors and swallowed the keys. As the sun began to rise on August 15th, the confusion inside the German ranks turned into a tactical catastrophe. This was the launch of Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. A massive fleet of over 800 ships was approaching the coast. Battleships like the USS Texas and the French Lorraine were angling their guns. Thousands of paratroopers were dropping into the misty valleys behind the beaches. Normally, this is the moment a defender strikes back. This is when the Panzers roll. But the 11th Panzer Division, the only significant armored reserve Blaskowitz had, was stuck. They weren't stuck because of enemy fire. They were stuck because they couldn't cross the Rhone River. The resistance had blown the bridges. When they tried to use the rail lines to move their heavy tanks, they found the tracks twisted into steel pretzels. Reports from the 19th Army War Diary capture the mood. Enemy airborne landings reported in Lemouy, unable to confirm strength, communications with coastal batteries severe, local population hostile. Sabotage widespread. The language is dry, military German, but reading between the lines, you see the panic. They couldn't distinguish between the Allied paratroopers and the French resistance fighters. In many cases, they were the same thing. The Allied paratroopers dropped into areas that the resistance had already secured. Instead of fighting for every inch of ground, the Americans and British found French guides waiting for them, with wine, maps, and information on exactly where the German bunkers were. The German command tried to issue orders to liquidate the terrorist bands. But you can't liquidate a fog. Convoys sent to hunt down the Maquis were ambushed. Dispatch riders, motorcyclists carrying the orders that couldn't be sent by phone, were strung up by wires across the road. The command loop, the OADA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, was broken. The Germans couldn't observe because their lines were cut. They couldn't orient because their maps were wrong. They couldn't decide because they had no intel. And they couldn't act because their trucks were burning. While the Allied troops stormed the beaches of the Riviera with surprisingly light casualties, the German army behind the lines was being eaten alive by an enemy they couldn't see. By midday on August 15th, the reality of the situation had reached General Blaskowitz. The Allied landings were successful. The Mediterranean Wall had been breached in hours, not days. But the real shock was the interior. The entire region of Provence was in open revolt. Cities like Toulouse and Marseille were seeing street fighting initiated not by Allied soldiers but by local citizens. Blaskowitz had to make a decision. If he stayed and fought on the coast, his army would be encircled. The Americans were moving fast, faster than expected, because the resistance was clearing the roads for them. If he stayed, he would be cut off from Germany. His only option was to retreat. He had to pull Army Group G out of southern France and race north to link up with the German forces near the Vosges Mountains. He issued the order, General Retreat up the Rhone Valley. This should have been a standard military maneuver. A fighting withdrawal is difficult, but the German army was the master of it. They had done it in Russia. They had done it in Italy. But they had never done it through a country that hated them this much, with an armed citizenry that sensed blood in the water. The retreat order was transmitted via the few remaining high-frequency radio links. But even this was compromised. The resistance, working with Allied intelligence teams, Jedburgh teams, intercepted the order. They knew exactly where the Germans were going. They knew they had to funnel through the narrow roads of the Rhone Valley. This was where the insider sabotage shifted to open warfare. The Maquis didn't just cut wires anymore, they blocked the retreat. They felled ancient plane trees across the avenues. They created rock slides in the mountain passes. They forced the German columns to slow down, to bunch up, to stop. And when a German column stops in 1944, it dies. Because looking down from the sky were the American fighter bombers. The German reaction to this new phase of the battle was a mix of fury and self-pity. Intercepted letters from German soldiers and reports from field commanders use words like treachery and cowardice to describe the resistance. They couldn't accept that these civilians were defeating them. They felt it was unfair, against the rules of war. One captured German officer shouted at his American captors, "You didn't beat us. We were stabbed in the back by these bandits." It was the same old lie the Nazis told themselves, but this time the stab was real, and it was fatal. The Gestapo and the SS, realizing their time was up, lashed out with horrific violence. As they retreated, they committed massacres, burning villages and executing hostages in a desperate attempt to terrorize the population one last time. But it didn't work. The fear was gone. The French knew the Germans were running. General Blaskowitz sent a cable to the High Command in Berlin that stands as a testament to the effectiveness of the resistance. He wrote, "The development of the situation in the rear areas has taken a catastrophic turn. Large bandit groups control the roads. Supply is impossible. The movement of troops is subject to constant ambush. We are no longer the masters of the terrain. Number longer the masters of the terrain." This was an admission of total defeat. The Nazis prided themselves on order, on control. To admit that they had lost control of the very ground under their boots was to admit that their occupation had failed. They were being evicted not just by the U.S. 7th Army, but by the people of France. The psychological toll on the German soldier was immense. They couldn't sleep. They couldn't rest. Every shadow could be a Maquis with a Sten gun. They were exhausted, dirty, and terrified. The myth of the Aryan Superman dissolved in the heat of the French summer, replaced by the reality of a scared man trying to run home while an entire nation tried to kill him. The retreat up the Rhone Valley became known as the Convoy of Death. It was a 200-mile gauntlet of fire. Because the resistance slowed the Germans down, the Allied air forces had a field day. The roads were littered with the burning hulks of trucks, tanks, and horse-drawn wagons. At the Battle of Montélimar, the resistance played a crucial role. They seized the high ground overlooking the valley. They acted as spotters for American artillery. They used their light weapons to pin down German infantry, preventing them from deploying against the American tanks blocking the road. The result was carnage. The German 19th Army was shattered. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. And this is where the dynamic shifted again. German soldiers, who had spent 4 years strutting through French towns as conquerors, were now surrendering to the very people they had oppressed. There are photos from this period of ragged, shoeless resistance fighters, men and women, guarding columns of dejected German prisoners. The Nazi command in Berlin was apoplectic. Hitler demanded that Blaskowitz stand and fight, that he turn and crush the terrorists. But Hitler was moving phantom divisions on a map in a bunker thousands of miles away. Blaskowitz was on the ground, watching his army disintegrate. He ignored the orders to stand fast and kept running. He knew that if he stopped, the resistance would swarm over them like ants over a carcass. By the time the German forces finally linked up with their northern counterparts near the German border in September, they were a shell of their former selves. They had lost most of their heavy equipment, not in a great tank battle, but in 1,000 small ambushes and airstrikes made possible by the resistance. They had lost southern France in 4 weeks, a campaign that was expected to take months. Operation Dragoon is often called the Champagne Campaign or the Forgotten D-Day. It doesn't get the movies or the glory that Normandy does, but in terms of strategic success, it was flawless. And that success was built on the foundation of the French resistance. The Nazi command said they were fighting, quote, terrorists. They said they were fighting bandits. But what they were really saying, what their panic and their reports revealed, was that they had underestimated the power of a unified people. They thought that because they had the tanks and the uniforms, they had the power. They forgot that power also resides in the person who flips the railway switch, the operator who cuts the phone line, and the farmer who watches the road. When the lines went dead on August 15th, the German High Command stared into the abyss of their own failure. They realized that you can occupy a country, but you cannot conquer it if the people refuse to submit. The silence in the headquarters of Army Group G wasn't just a technical glitch. It was the sound of freedom returning to France. The Maquis paid a heavy price. Thousands were killed in the fighting and the reprisals, but they achieved something that few irregular forces in history have ever done. They didn't just help an invasion, they accelerated the end of the war. They saved countless Allied lives by taking the brunt of the German confusion. So the next time you hear about D-Day, remember there were 2. And in the second one, the one in the south, the silence that terrified the Nazis wasn't the silence of a bomb. It was the silence of a phone line that had been cut by a baker, a teacher, or a mechanic who had finally decided that enough was enough. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of World War II, make sure you're subscribed to Hidden Horizon Hub. We tell the stories that the textbooks leave out. Leave a comment below. Had you ever heard of Operation Dragoon before today? I read every comment, and I'd love to know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.